video, I wanted to talk about 3 important aspects to keep in mind when painting lights like candlelight with acrylics. This is my very festive reference photo, very appropriate for this season. I decided to paint it with golden open acrylics. They dry very slowly and they're very nice and easy to work with. As usual, when I paint with opaque media, I don't like to start on a white surface, so I toned my gesso board with yellow. It's just regular acrylic paint. It dried almost instantly, and now I have a nice warm surface to work on. I would say I much prefer painting on board than on canvas because it's smooth, it has no texture, which is my personal preference, and also it's a very sturdy surface. It doesn't bounce when I apply paint. Let's prepare our palette. I have a sheet of gray matters, disposable palette paper, and I'll squeeze out my colors. Warm colors go on the left, a couple of yellows and a couple of reds. Cool colors go on the right. I only have 2 blues, cobalt blue and phthalo blue. And of course I will need white. 2 piles for mixing with warm and cool colors without any contamination. I draw the composition very lightly with my brush. It's not super complicated, I just need to make sure that everything fits and sits kind of in the center of my painting. I'm treating those candles as basically one large shape. There will be 3 circles for those glass ornaments, so just very basic drawing. Everything else I can add after I start painting. I'm marking the flame, which will be in the center of each candle, just to make sure I positioned everything correctly and the candles are not evenly spaced or anything like that, and everything looks nice. We can start painting. I'm starting with the background. And here's my first tip. My first recommendation is to have patience and gradually build up the painting surface. You see I'm applying my various shades of blue. I am mixing in cool red right into it. I also get green where the blue paint is applied more transparently because I have the deep yellow on the painting. I'm creating the dark background around my candles, but there is very little depth to it. It looks pretty flat and kind of even patchy. This happens because acrylics are fairly transparent paint and it takes several layers, at least 2 if not more, to build up that painting surface and to make it look complex and beautiful. So at this early stage, let's not expect to finish, so to say, the background. The first step is just to distribute color and start creating the tonal range. And then we will keep working on this painting. We will not give up on it, even though it doesn't look very attractive from the beginning, because it will all get better as we build up the painting surface. I will work on the table as well. I'm using a warmer color here. Again, this area is not finished. It's just a rough start to build the foundation of my painting. I use a fan brush to move the paint in the background and to smooth out the brush strokes, which brings me to my second tip. Smooth brush strokes recede, so they work best for darks, for shadows, and textured brush strokes come forward, so they work for lights and highlights. We will talk about this a little later in the video. When I paint lights, this of course applies to realistic style painting. For now, we just need to remember that distant areas and shadows look better, and by better I mean realistic, with smoother brush strokes. Let's continue working on the painting with midtones. I'm painting the candles, giving them a little color variation. Some areas are lighter, more kind of pale yellow. Some areas have a little bit of orange and red glow in them. Mostly working with this ochre color and yellow. I also want to paint the Christmas tree branch. Again, it's almost impossible to make it look finished right from the start, so just giving us a base for future development at this stage. I very lightly mark the lights again, since this helps me to check the geometry of my painting and my tonal range to some extent. It makes my brain understand that there will be something very bright, a highlight right here. As you see, the painting is slowly taking shape. I covered all the surface, but of course I need to work on it some more. This brings me to the third thing I wanted to mention in this video. I find it very important and helpful to always be aware what areas of the painting have wet paint and what areas are dry. Golden open acrylics are easier to work with in this respect because they dry slowly, so basically all my paint is wet and will stay wet for a while. With regular acrylics, this will not be the case. Knowing where the paint is wet and dry affects how we create edges, which are the lines between light and shadow. If the paint is wet, it's easy to blend it and create a soft edge. For hard edges, wet paint might be too mushy. It will also affect our color mixing. Applying wet paint into wet will look different than applying wet paint onto a dry surface. It's not that I'm constantly checking my paint to see if it's dry or wet, but if a certain area gives me trouble and I can't seem to get it right, I stop and I ask myself, do I need to wait for this paint to dry? Maybe this is the problem. While my background is still fresh and wet, I'm painting some lighter areas. I like that subtle smoke that's floating around the candles and around the lights that are in the distance in the reference photo, so I'm going to paint it. Again, this contributes to the complexity and depth of my painting surface, to the visual interest of my painting overall. Of course, I don't want this area to compete with the candles, so we need to keep the brush strokes flat and well blended, as we discussed before. And as you see, because the background paint is still wet, I kind of drag it into my color. Colors mix with the background to a certain extent, so it's a bit tricky to work on something like this at this stage. It requires a light touch, but again, I will go over this area later and I will make corrections and I will get everything where it needs to be. I am just building the first layer of my painting. This is still the first layer of my painting. Darkening the background around the candles because I want them to stand out. This is it for the first day of painting. I spritz my palette with a bit of water and I'm closing the lid on my Stay Wet palette as tightly as I can. I left this painting to dry for about 24 hours. By then, the first layer that I applied during the first session was dry and not moving or interfering in any way with the colors on my second layer, so we can continue working on the painting. To get the textured brush strokes for the lightest areas of my painting, I want to give my acrylics some more body. Golden Open are pretty substantial, but they still have a lot of transparency. I'm going to add Golden's regular gel to my white to make it go on even thicker. I've had that gel for a while now, so it's pretty thick. If yours is fresh, you might want to use some other medium that has a little more body. As I mentioned, not only cool colors recede and warm colors come forward, flat brush strokes recede and textured brush strokes come forward. I feel I need to work on the Christmas ornaments. They look a bit muddy and need another layer to build up the surface, I'm thinking. The red ornament casts some warm reflections on the other two, the golden ones. Let's make sure the geometry is right, that they are round and not squashed or anything like that. I'm moving on to highlights, and here it's a good idea to use two brushes, one for light colors and the second one for darks. So it's easy to keep them clean and we don't have to wash them constantly. I think I mentioned this in my earlier acrylic tutorials. It's very handy to use with two brushes at the same time. Sometimes I get them mixed up, but that's no big deal. In general, I try to use one brush for lighter colors and one brush for darker colors. And by the way, I linked some other acrylic demonstrations in the description under this video. is very close to being finished. You can see that the objects are taking shape, the tonal relationships are getting more and more realistic. The candles are standing out against the dark background. The ornaments start looking very round and shiny, sparkly. I don't have the lights yet. Let's mix some medium with white. And I'll even use the palette knife to paint the lights because I really want them to be like a one textured brush stroke. The distant ones need to be softened. I applied them with a palette knife, but they will not have hard edges. They're blurred. So I'm blurring them with a brush. The flame on the candles will be defined, and I want that flame to be very opaque and kind of three-dimensional. I hope you'll agree that my painting immediately comes to life and starts to sparkle. I corrected my highlights, those sparkling lights, with a small brush. It's important also to paint the dark wicks on the candles. They're right there in the center of each flame. They make the candles look a lot more realistic. We can't miss them. The finishing touch will be to tone down the distant lights a bit more. I think they're competing with the flame here in the foreground. Maybe I'll make them slightly cooler. I'm going to mix in a little light blue there. And I also want to paint a branch on the left side to balance the right. It's not in the reference photo, but we'll always do what's best for our painting, right? We are not tied down by the reference photo. Here's the finished painting. I let it dry for a couple of days, and I did two more things. I painted the edges of my cradle gesso board with black acrylic, just regular acrylic. It only takes a few minutes and gives the painting a more finished, more kind of polished look. The second thing I did was apply matte medium made by Liquitex to the dry surface with a foam brush. That toned down that acrylic shine, and I think the painting just looks better. It's easier to photograph, there's no glare, and it's also easier to display it. I hope you found some useful information in this video. Thank you so much for watching it, and I'll see you in the next one. Help other artists to see this video by liking or sharing it. To see future videos, subscribe and click the bell button to be notified when they're published. Thanks again and stay creative!